All right, let's unpack this. We're jumping straight into a story that, well, on the surface, it looks like pretty standard stuff, if maybe a little dramatic. We're talking about the Trump administration's actions against Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela back in early 2026. If you were just reading the headlines at the time, you might think, okay, another crisis in Latin America, another chapter in that long, complicated book of U.S. relations with the region.
Uh-oh.
But the source material we've gathered for this deep dive, it frames this in a completely different light.
It really does. I mean, the analysis we're looking at, it just immediately dismisses that idea. It says this is not just another diplomatic incident.
Yeah.
It actually views this whole confrontation around Maduro not as a cause of instability, but as a symptom, a really clear, definitive symptom of a rupture in the entire post-World War II global order.
A rupture, that's a strong word.
It is. The source argues this is an inflection point whose implications, if you really follow the logic, rival 9/11 in their structural scale. Maybe not in the immediate, spectacular visuals, but in terms of what it means for the architecture of the world.
A rupture comparable to 9/11. Wow. Okay, so that framing is telling us right off the bat is that the foundations, the institutions that have governed global security, trade, all of it for what, nearly 80 years? They aren't just under stress. They are functionally breaking down. They've become brittle.
Brittle is the perfect word.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. We are witnessing the exhaustion of an old design. These institutions we all grew up thinking were permanent, the WTO, the UN, even NATO, they're now revealing themselves as functionally obsolete.
Obsolete, not just struggling, but obsolete.
Yes, because they were designed for a very specific historical configuration of power. And that configuration has, well, it's just gone. It's evaporated.
So the mission for us today is, it's clearly much bigger than just Venezuela. We're going to use this Maduro crisis, which is a crisis of enforcement, a crisis of legitimacy, as a kind of diagnostic tool. We need to connect the dots between these, geopolitical flare-ups abroad and the deep structural design failures happening right here at home. And specifically, the source ties this directly to the U.S. drug epidemic, which is a connection I don't think many people make.
And it's an absolutely critical connection. That's the whole project for this deep dive. We have to understand why building a new global architecture isn't just some, academic wish. It's become an imperative for survival. The old system is collapsing. And this is the key point the source makes again and again. It's not collapsing because of some great moral failure. It's collapsing because it succeeded for a very long time in a world that structurally just doesn't exist anymore.
So you have 21st century problems.
And you're trying to shove them through 20th century institutional plumbing.
Yeah.
The friction is creating fire.
Okay, so let's start there. With the plumbing, part one. The evidence of this collapse. The source material is, like you said, unflinchingly blunt about it. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, is described as, and this is a quote, functionally dead.
Functionally dead. Not just struggling, but dead for its intended purpose.
Right. Then there's the United Nations, the UN, which it says looks increasingly ceremonial.
Just a stage for speeches, not for action.
And even NATO, which in the West is so often talked about as this sacred architecture. The analysis says it feels profoundly vulnerable, maybe for the first time in its entire history.
And we have to keep hammering this point home because it's so important to the core argument. This collapse is presented as structural, not moral. It's not about the people running these places being bad or incompetent. It's about the engineering. The blueprints for the UN Security Council, the WTO, the NATO Charter, they were all optimized for a single, unique historical moment.
The world of 1945.
The world in 1945, the immediate post-WWII era, defined by overwhelming American financial and military primacy. And then later, that design was adapted for the bipolar Cold War standoff. But the constant variable was that these institutions were designed to operate best when the U.S. was the overwhelming guarantor of last resort.
That phrase, optimization for dominance, is so critical, I think. We tend to think that because an institution has lasted a long time, it must be inherently good or flexible. But the argument here is that it was engineered for a specific power dynamic. So when did that dynamic fade? When did that historical moment end, according to this analysis?
The sources are very specific on this. They argue that the true, undeniable shift to what we call multipolarity, where you have multiple independent centers of gravity, that moment became undeniable around 2008.
2008. Okay, that's not that long ago, but it feels like a lifetime. Walk us through that. What happened in 2008 that was so structurally significant?
Well, think about what the world was like just before 2008. It was the peak of the unipolar moment, right? The post-Cold War world. You had the Washington Consensus, this idea that the U.S. model of free market capitalism and democracy was the only game in town. It seemed unchallengeable.
I remember that, the end of history and all that.
Exactly. But 2008 brought several fundamental ruptures to that idea. First, and most obviously, the global financial crisis. That wasn't just a recession, it was a demonstration of deep systemic instability inside the very engine of global capitalism. It just shattered the faith in the economic orthodoxy that the U.S. had been exporting for decades.
Extra, the system wasn't infallible.
Far from it. And second, at the exact same time, you have the sustained, unchallenged rise of these alternative economic poles, specifically the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They started asserting their own development models. They were decoupling from Western political prescriptions. China, in particular, just sailed through the 2008 crisis, demonstrating its economic resilience and its capacity to act as a truly independent global player.
So, if the architecture was built on a unipolar blueprint, but the world has been functionally multipolar since 2008, that's the mismatch. You're trying to force multiple engines, multiple military powers, multiple civilizational models into containers that were only ever designed for one.
That's it. That is the mismatch. And when that happens, the system doesn't just bend, it becomes brittle. It starts to break.
Yeah.
And like we said, that friction produces fire.
So let's talk about the economic fire first. The WTO. The key insight in the source material is fascinating. It says the WTO didn't die because trade stopped. Global trade is bigger than ever. It died because trust stopped.
That is the entire ballgame right there. That is the critical distinction. The whole framework of the WTO was built on three, you could say, very liberal, very optimistic assumptions. And those assumptions were just overwhelmed by reality once the U.S. lost that overwhelming economic dominance.
Okay, what were those three fragile assumptions? Let's tick them off.
Okay, number one was the assumption that trade rules would apply symmetrically, that the same rules would apply to the U.S., to Germany, China, to Vietnam, regardless of their economic size or their domestic policies.
A level playing field.
In theory, a level playing field. The second assumption was that any disputes would be adjudicated impartially by this thing called the appellate body. The idea was that this body would be like the Supreme Court of Trade, totally free of political bias or national security pressure.
And the third?
The third, and this was the big one, the most crucial one, was that raw power politics would stay outside this system, that countries wouldn't use their military or political leverage to get a better trade deal. Trade was supposed to be its own separate rules-based world.
But none of that held up, did it? I mean, we all saw it happen. Major powers, starting with the U.S. but followed by others, started invoking national security exceptions for everything. Steel tariffs, technology bans. They essentially found one tiny loophole in the contract and drove a truck through it.
They drove a fleet of trucks through it. It became the dominant feature, not the exception. And you have to understand, once one major power decides its own industrial policy or its national security is more important than the rules, the whole system of rules-based trade becomes meaningless.
Because everyone else has to follow suit to protect themselves.
Of course. The referee, which was that WTO appellate body, effectively left the field. The sources describe it as becoming a courtroom without judges. Appeals just stalled forever because countries, including the U.S., would just block the appointment of new judges. And even when rulings were made, they were just ignored.
So trade didn't stop. It just became weaponized. A street fight. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls. They became the new normal, replacing predictable trade agreements.
It's exactly right. Economic coercion replaced economic competition. And you just cannot govern a system designed for one dominant power in a reality that's defined by 5 or 6 competing, suspicious great powers. The moment one of them pulls out that national security card, every other power has both the right and, frankly, the incentive to do the same. And the whole thing just collapses into a power-based system again.
Okay, so that's the economic architecture. Let's pivot to the military and security side. NATO and the UN. The sources say NATO succeeded brilliantly at its original mission, right? Deterring the Soviet Union and Europe.
Brilliantly. It was maybe one of the most successful defensive alliances in history for that specific purpose.
But the question the analysis asks is, did that very success stretch it to the breaking point?
That's a deep and difficult question, and the sources argue yes, absolutely. NATO was a highly focused defensive pact. It was designed for a specific enemy, the USSR, and a specific geography, Europe. It was never, ever designed to manage the fragmented, messy conflicts that emerged after the Cold War. It wasn't designed for counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, or for managing the fallout of a collapsed state in Libya, or for countering Modern hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, those things require resources and doctrines way outside its original charter.
And then there's the expansion. When an organization keeps getting bigger, adding new members, but it doesn't fundamentally redefine its mission for the new century, it loses focus.
It loses focus and it loses legitimacy in the eyes of those outside the club. It stretches itself dangerously thin. To non-members, and you have to think especially about great powers like Russia or China, that relentless eastward expansion without a clear redefinition of purpose, it just started to look like encirclement, a threat. So unintentionally, NATO began to accumulate adversaries faster than it accumulated new, genuinely committed and aligned allies. It traded deep cohesion for geographic breadth. And that's why today, that sacred architecture feels so vulnerable. A promise to defend everyone is only credible if you actually have the coherent will and capacity to do so everywhere, all at once.
And if NATO is the, let's call it the strained functional muscle of global enforcement, then the UN is the rule book it's supposed to be following. But the UN's core weakness, according to the source, is almost philosophical. It has no muscle of its own.
Zero. That's its tragic flaw, built in from the beginning. Any law, whether it's domestic law or international law, it depends on the credible threat of enforcement. The UN has always relied almost entirely on the United States and to a much lesser extent a few other powers for any credible enforcement. It's an organization built on beautiful, soaring idealism, but it's powered by the unilateral might of its most powerful members.
Which means the whole system is only as functional as the least cooperative member of the Security Council. And that council, of course, hardwires veto power for the 5 victors of World War II. It's a snapshot of 1945, frozen in time.
And that institutional inertia is the death knell for effective governance today. A Security Council designed to manage a bipolar standoff between the U.S. and USSR, or maybe a unipolar world where everyone agrees. It is constitutionally incapable of governing a world with 5 or more centers of power. You have China, India, the U.S., Europe, Russia, all with dramatically different interests, different values, different civilizational models. That mismatch is precisely why, as the source says, the UN is increasingly dismissed as just ceremonial whenever a real great power crisis erupts. It has no tools for a multipolar world.
Which brings us directly to the case that sparked this whole analysis, the Maduro paradox. This case, according to our sources, is the perfect illustration of this entire structural breakdown. You have the global enforcer, the U.S., trying to act, but within a framework that just doesn't work anymore.
It really is the central paradox of this entire post-Cold War era. The U.S. took on the role of sole global enforcer, underwriting security, keeping sea lanes open, managing the financial system. And yet, if you look at the track record, we have repeatedly, systemically failed at enforcement itself. The source material lists Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Not as, minor diplomatic missteps. It lists them as massive, blinking warning signs.
Warnings of what?
Warnings that we were making a massive, repeated mistake, confusing coercive power with broad legitimacy.
Okay, we need to really unpack that distinction for everyone listening. Power versus legitimacy. If we're talking about actual law enforcement, like police in a city, what are the 2 pillars you need for it to work?
The sources define them very, very clearly. For any kind of long-term stability, you need 2 absolute pillars. First, you need the capacity to enforce. That's the raw power. The military, the police, the coercive ability to remove a threat or impose your will. But second, and this is just as vital, you need the broad acceptance of your authority. That is legitimacy. It's the belief held by the governed or by the international community that you have the right to enforce the rules.
And the big mistake of the post-Cold War era was thinking that if you had the first one, the power, you automatically had the second one, the legitimacy.
Precisely. Just because you have the world's biggest military doesn't mean you have the moral or political authority to use it wherever you want, sustainably. The source uses a great analogy. Think of organized crime. A cartel can control a huge territory through sheer violence. They have the capacity to enforce. They have power. But that doesn't grant them legitimacy. No one believes they have the right to rule. And so power without legitimacy only ever produces temporary fragile order. And it's always followed by a deeper, more violent collapse the moment that power is withdrawn or challenged.
So the military victory in Iraq in 2003 was the power.
A stunning display of power. And the catastrophic failure to establish a broadly accepted functional government in the years that followed, that was the failure of legitimacy.
And this is where it gets, as the source says, really interesting. This connects this abstract idea directly to the mess in Venezuela. The political case against Maduro is pretty clear, right? Dismantled democracy, hollowed out institutions, human rights abuses. But the sources highlight these explosive allegations, and they stress, if proven, that Maduro's government essentially leads or protects a major narcotics cartel.
Right. And if those allegations hold up, you are witnessing something historically corrosive. You have, and the source uses this phrase, a mafia don wearing the robes of a head of state. This fusion of an outright criminal enterprise with the legal, sovereign, internationally recognized authority of a nation-state that is structurally devastating to the global system.
Why? Why is that specific fusion crime and sovereignty so much more destabilizing than just, say, a regular dictatorship?
Because our entire international system, the UN Security Council, diplomacy, banking regulations, everything, it was all designed for state-to-state engagement. It's based on the core assumption that even your adversaries are states and that they operate according to certain bounded state-centric rules. They care about their borders, their economy, their international reputation to some degree.
They want a seat at the table.
They want a seat at the table. The system was never, ever intended to regulate states that behave like transnational criminal organizations. Or, to flip it around, cartels that have successfully captured the entire apparatus of a state.
It completely breaks that foundational assumption of international law, that there's a clear line between political authority and pure criminality.
It obliterates the line. And think about what that means for our tools. Traditional remedies, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, trade restrictions, they all assume that the state you're targeting retains some interest in its own long-term survival and its relationship with the world. But what happens when the state's primary purpose is no longer the welfare of its people, but maximizing illicit profit for a tiny, criminalized elite? The conventional tools become blunt. They might even backfire because the regime can use them to strengthen its grip, blaming outsiders for the suffering.
You create a paradox then. The more outrageously criminal the behavior, the harder it becomes to use the normal tools of accountability because the perpetrators are hiding behind the legal shield of sovereignty.
That's the paradox. And that's the nightmare scenario that Maduro represents.
So if the global system is collapsing and conventional tools don't work, intervention might sometimes seem necessary. But the lessons from history about how you intervene become absolutely critical. You can't just go in guns blazing.
All right. Enforcement is a tool, a very powerful and dangerous tool. It is not a panacea. And we have these clear, painful precedents that show again and again that enforcement divorced from a plan for legitimacy creates chronic, long-term instability. It makes the problem worse. It's worth looking at the structural failures of these past interventions because they offer a roadmap of what not to do.
Okay, let's start with the big one. Iraq, 2003.
In Iraq, the tactical goal removing Saddam Hussein was achieved in a matter of weeks. A stunning military success. The structural failure was what happened the day after. The decisions made immediately in the aftermath. Specifically, the wholesale decimation of the Iraqi state. The policy of de-Baathification, which purged anyone with party ties, and the decision to completely dissolve the Iraqi army.
So you took out the top leader.
And you took out the entire middle layer of institutional knowledge and capacity. Suddenly, you had an enormous population of skilled, well-armed, military-aged men with no jobs, no pensions, and a deep hostility to the new order. You created a perfect vacuum. And insurgents and extremist groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq flooded right in to fill it. The intervention removed the head, but it obliterated the central nervous system, guaranteeing years in chaos.
And what about Libya in 2011? Is it a similar story?
The source argues Libya is arguably an even worse outcome in terms of sheer state fragmentation. Gaddafi's overthrow was rapid, but unlike Iraq, which at least had some history of strong state institutions, Libya under Gaddafi was basically run by one man and his family. There was no robust civil society, no independent institutions. When you combine that institutional vacuum with the immediate availability of massive caches of weapons,
the state just dissolved.
It completely dissolved. It immediately devolved into a multi-sided civil war, controlled by shifting coalitions of militias, tribes, and foreign-backed proxies. Enforcement, again, removed the leader, but it catalyzed the state's total disintegration. It turned Libya from a stable, if brutal, dictatorship into a failed state that exports instability, weapons, and refugees across the entire region.
The source does single out one case, though, as an exception. Panama, 1989. The removal of Manuel Noriega. It says that one actually worked. Why was that different?
That's a great question, and the difference is everything. Panama succeeded precisely because the intervention and the transition were handled completely differently. The plan wasn't just remove the leader. The transition relied heavily on pre-existing Panamanian institutions that were preserved and strengthened. Critically, there was a functional, if repressed, opposition party and civil society that was ready to step in. The succession was planned. The scope was limited.
So the goal wasn't to remake the country from scratch.
Exactly. The core takeaway from all these examples is stark. Removing a single person is not the same thing as restoring legitimacy. When you're dealing with these criminalized states that break all the old rules, the solution has to be structural. It has to focus on institutional continuity, on engaging with local civil society, on getting coordinated regional backing. Not just the tactical military removal of one guy at the top.
It's the idea that legitimacy has to be built horizontally, from the citizens and institutions up, not imposed vertically by a foreign power.
That's it. Unilateral enforcement, even when you feel is morally justified, always risks being seen as coercion without consent, and that just guarantees long-term resistance and instability. The Maduro situation is the ultimate stress test of this idea. Can the world figure out how to intervene in a way that actually helps build something sustainable and legitimate, or is every intervention from here on out doomed to just deepen the rot?
This is a perfect pivot point. We've established the global structure is failing, and the role of the enforcer is in crisis. Now we have to turn the mirror inward, because the source material makes a really brutal, really dramatic claim here. It says the U.S. is too imperfect a democracy and too distorted an economy to credibly export its political or economic model anymore. The global failure is rooted in a profound domestic one.
And this diagnosis of domestic dysfunction it's just stark. The source pulls no punches. The symptoms it lists are described as, and this is a chilling comparison, uncomfortably familiar to students of late Soviet history.
Wow. The late Soviet Union. That's a comparison you don't hear every day. What are the parallels?
Well, think about the hallmarks of a decaying superpower. First, institutional paralysis, a government that recognizes huge problems, infrastructure, healthcare, climate, but is gridlocked and incapable of passing meaningful long-term solutions. Second, massive wealth inequality and what the source calls elite capture.
Okay, let's break down that term elite capture. What does that mean in the American context today?
Elite capture describes a scenario where the actual processes of government, the regulatory agencies, the way legislation is written, even parts of the judiciary, get co-opted by the very wealthy and the powerful few they serve. So instead of, say, an agency regulating an industry for the public good, the regulators end up being former executives from that industry, and they write rules that serve the long-term financial interests of that industry.
The fox is guarding the henhouse.
On an industrial scale. And what that does is it creates policy gridlock. Genuine structural reform, whether it's in healthcare, finance, or energy, becomes almost impossible because the political elites in both parties are benefiting from the current distorted status quo. That leads directly to that institutional paralysis we were talking about.
And this is linked to another phrase the source uses, a performative political culture.
Right. And that refers to a political environment that prioritizes messaging and spectacle over actual outcomes. Politicians take actions not because they're effective policy, but because they generate media attention, they spark outrage on social media, or they galvanize their base for the next fundraising email. Governance becomes a kind of theater of virtue signaling and manufactured conflict. Winning the 24-hour news cycle becomes more important than solving complex, multi-decade problems, and the source argues that is the absolute antithesis of what a functioning democracy requires, which is sober, pragmatic, dedicated problem-solving.
And if that wasn't a big enough problem, now we have the AI revolution, which you'd think would help, but the analysis says it just scales the dysfunction.
A tool is only as good as the system you put it into, right? The source argues the AI revolution scales dysfunction just as efficiently as it scales productivity. If your underlying political culture is already broken, if your politicians are already prioritizing performance, well, AI just helps them perform faster, more convincingly. It helps them target their outrage messaging with terrifying precision. It allows for the creation of sophisticated deepfakes. A technological solution can't fix a structural or political deficit. In fact, it often just amplifies the existing flaws.
The analysis then goes even deeper, beyond politics and economics, into what it calls a spiritual dysfunction. And it offers a very sharp, very specific philosophical critique of the term Christian nationalism. This feels like a sensitive area, so we should stick really closely to the source's reasoning here.
It is a sensitive area, but it's a powerful and necessary point for the overall structural analysis. The source calls the phrase Christian nationalism itself incoherent. and a contradiction in terms.
Hmm.
The reason it says that is because it argues this phenomenon fundamentally confuses genuine spirituality with a narrow political identity.
So how does the source define genuine unifying spirituality then, to create that contrast?
It argues that genuine spirituality of any faith is inherently expansive and universal. It makes room for the family, the dignity, and the community of the believer, yes. But it must, by its very definition, leave no room for the hatred of other families, other nations, or other faiths. It's a universal ethic of care and dignity. The moment you weaponize your spirituality, the moment you use it to justify exclusion or political superiority or to marginalize others, it ceases to be spiritual. It just becomes another political tool, completely divorced from its original unifying purpose. It becomes a machine for identifying enemies, not for seeking transcendence.
Okay, so you have this domestic dysfunction, the paralysis, the elite capture, the spiritual malaise. And that leads us directly to one of its most tragic and visible symptoms, the American drug crisis. The source is incredibly aggressive in challenging the common narrative here. The idea that the epidemic is solely a supply problem, that it's all about cartels and porous borders.
It calls that narrative economic illiteracy, just a profound failure of systems thinking. You cannot solve a demand problem by focusing only on supply. It's like trying to fix a flooded basement by only bailing out water without ever looking for the broken pipe. Markets have two sides, and the demand side of the American drug crisis is being driven by the fundamental design failures of the American social and economic system.
This is the idea of the manufacturing of despair.
It's exactly that. The source argues a deeply unequal society that fails to provide the basic components of a stable human life. It literally manufactures despair on an industrial scale. What are those components? Universal education that actually prepares citizens for a modern economy, affordable health care that treats both chronic physical pain and mental illness, and stable, dignified housing that prevents social breakdown. When you fail to provide those things, you produce despair. And despair is demand. It's demand for escapism, for numbness, often through the cheapest, most powerful substances available, like synthetic opioids and fentanyl. The source puts it very starkly. We are importing fentanyl because we are mass-producing domestic despair.
And what's so frustrating reading this analysis is that it points out that America seems to refuse to learn. Even though the fixes are known, they exist, they're proven, the source basically invites us to go on a global shopping trip for solutions.
And these solutions are not theoretical. They are empirical, they are effective, they are working right now in other developed nations. The analysis says we have to recognize that structural deficits require structural fixes. And it cites a few specific, successful models that get at the roots of this despair. First, it points to Singapore's model for education and public housing. In Singapore, your access to a high-quality education and to safe, stable housing is not determined by your wealth or your zip code. This creates a genuine ladder of upward mobility and provides stability for the vast majority of the population.
And second, there's Vienna's social housing model. This is a really powerful example.
It's an amazing example. Vienna is a city that's far smaller and historically much poorer than the United States as a whole, and yet it successfully implemented a system of municipal, high-quality, architecturally diverse social housing that provides community stability. It's not just cheap shelter. It's designed to build community.
Let's stay on that Vienna model for a second, because that sounds like a massive undertaking. How does that specifically link to reducing the demand for drugs?
It operates on a principle of integration and dignity. This isn't about warehousing the poor in isolated, crumbling projects, which has been the American model. The housing in Vienna is intentionally mixed income. It's high quality, it's well-maintained and subsidized, and it frequently includes on-site services, parks, doctors' offices, daycare. It's seen as a public asset, not a burden. By stabilizing hundreds of thousands of families, by guaranteeing that basic dignity and eliminating the constant existential fear of eviction or financial collapse from a rent spike, you eliminate a tremendous amount of the structural stress that fuels mental illness, trauma, and subsequently the demand for substance abuse. They tackled structural inequality through the design of their cities. And the third major fix the source cites is universal single-payer healthcare. The argument here is that it's not just a health fix, it's also a massive engine for economic efficiency. That's the key economic insight that often gets lost in the American debate. Single-payer systems in basically every other developed nation cost a fraction of the bloated, inefficient, privatized maze we have in the U.S. The source argues this isn't just about covering sick people, it's about economic stability. Cheaper, More efficient healthcare, paradoxically, enables huge tax cuts and economic dynamism elsewhere. If businesses don't have to carry the colossal administrative burden of providing insurance, and governments aren't paying inflated prices, it frees up enormous amounts of capital. It also reduces personal medical debt, which is one of the single biggest drivers of bankruptcy and despair in the U.S.
So this is all systems thinking. Investing in these three pillars, education, healthcare, housing, it isn't charity. It's essential, hidden infrastructure for a stable society and a productive economy.
Absolutely. Because without addressing those root causes of demand, all the supply-side enforcement, the police raids, the border walls, going after the cartels, it just becomes a futile, endless game of whack-a-mole. You might disrupt one cartel, but you haven't done anything to stop the despair that guarantees a new supplier will immediately rise to meet that relentless, homegrown demand. The source concludes that addiction is, fundamentally, a symptom of untreated trauma, chronic illness, and social neglect, all of which were amplified by these systemic design flaws.
So if America is showing all these symptoms, the paralysis, the despair, the broken model, the ultimate question for the whole deep dive becomes, is the system even capable of self-correction? Because if it can't fix itself, it has no chance of leading the world out of the global crisis.
That is the trillion-dollar question. If America is truly a democracy, the source argues, then it must be inherently self-correcting. That's the promise of democracy. If it loses that capacity for self-correction, if the elite capture and the paralysis become permanent features, then the system ceases to be a genuine democracy. It begins its slow drift toward collapse, regardless of how strong its military is or how advanced its technology gets.
The sources seem to point toward the year 2028 as this looming moment, suggesting that history shows a pendulum swing isn't just possible, but maybe overdue. A swing back toward an updated kind of Roosevelt moment of structural rebalancing.
That's the note of hope that the analysis offers. That a genuine self-correction would have to involve deep, structural interventions to rebalance the economy and restore the legitimacy of the country's own institutions. The source outlines several potential reforms that aren't radical fantasies. They're historically validated and economically sound. First, restoring top marginal tax rates to somewhere near 70%. And it's quick to remind us that this is still lower than the rates during the Cold War peaks, a time when American capitalism thrived and built the world's largest middle class. This is about rebalancing capital and labor.
What else?
Second, implementing truly classless education, breaking the link between zip code and destiny, and ending the cycle of inherited disadvantage. Third, adopting single-payer healthcare, primarily for the reasons of efficiency and economic stability we just discussed. And fourth, a massive scaling up of that Vienna-style social housing model to ensure housing security is treated as a fundamental right for all income levels.
And the source is very clear on one thing. America doesn't need a Deng Xiaoping. It doesn't need some autocratic strongman to come in and force reforms. The correction has to come democratically.
That is the democratic imperative. Democracies are not saved by strongmen, they are saved by we the people, rediscovering the collective will to prioritize good governance over political performance. If that collective will fails to materialize, then the structural drift just continues. The capacity for self-correction is the ultimate defining metric of a healthy democracy.
Okay, so we've established the global system is collapsing under its own outdated design, and the supposed enforcer, the U.S., is paralyzed by its own domestic dysfunction. Now, let's synthesize all of that into the absolute necessity for a new global design, one built for the world we actually live in. The source kicks off the section with a chilling fact. The world today has more active conflicts than at any point since the end of World War II, more than even at the height of the Cold War.
And that is the direct, predictable consequence of this architectural failure. It's what happens when the world tries to operate without any agreed-upon rules of the road or a credible referee. The sources stress this point. Multipolarity itself is not the problem. Having multiple great powers is not inherently unstable. Multipolar systems can be very stable. The 19th century concert of Europe is cited as an example. You had multiple great powers, but they created institutions, diplomatic norms, and a balance of power that, for a time, kept a relative peace.
So the problem isn't that there are multiple poles. The problem is that we have multiple economic engines, multiple military poles, multiple civilizational models, and they're all trying to operate under these single-pole institutions that were designed by and for the U.S. back in 1945.
That is the core structural mismatch in a single sentence. The absence of legitimate, accepted mechanisms to manage the friction between these competing centers of power. That's what produces the fire. That's why we have this constant cycle of proxy wars, sanctions spirals, trade conflicts, and diplomatic breakdowns. The source uses a tech analogy. You cannot retrofit a stable digital economy onto a coal-powered engine and expect it to run smoothly. We need new, shared institutions designed for the reality of today. Renovation isn't enough. We need a replacement.
So let's look at the lessons we can learn from the other major global pole, China. Specifically, the tension between its economic growth and its political structure. The source goes back to that classic comparison between Deng Xiaoping and Mikhail Gorbachev.
It's a really seminal comparison for understanding how states survive or fail in moments of crisis. Deng Xiaoping famously dismissed Gorbachev as stupid, and he had a reason. Deng had started China's deep economic reforms years earlier, and his whole strategy was based on one principle: feed the people first, politics can wait. He understood that the immediate existential risk was the collapse of the state, driven by economic deprivation and popular anger. So you had to deliver material prosperity first to restore legitimacy.
Gorbachev did the opposite, right? He started with political reform glasnost and perestroika before the economic foundation was stable.
Which fractured the state before the economy could sustain that political shift. The Soviet Union fell apart. Deng prioritized material stability and economic liberalization above all else, even if it meant postponing any kind of democratic political reform indefinitely. And by that metric, his strategy worked. It prevented state collapse, and it generated the most unprecedented economic growth in human history.
But the sources argue that while Deng successfully postponed the need for political reform, he didn't eliminate it.
Exactly. The chickens always come home to roost. The source suggests that China today is now in desperate need of what it calls a political Deng. They need a reformer who is capable of figuring out how to open up the political system, how to address the internal contradictions and institutional stress that come with that much wealth and complexity, without causing the entire state to fracture, like the Soviet Union did. It's an incredibly difficult balancing act.
And China's current behavior on the world stage, the source argues, actually betrays a profound insecurity, despite all its economic power.
It really does. The source points out that China's expansive, almost maximalist territorial claims, they stretch across nearly every border, reveal a deep anxiety, not confident strength. You see it with the claims in the South China Sea, the border with India. For instance, the claim on Arunachal Pradesh, which the source notes is historically and culturally India-facing, not South China Sea-facing. A confident, structurally stable great power doesn't behave that way. An anxious, highly centralized autocracy that fears internal instability. It often projects this kind of maximalist aggression externally as a way to unify domestic opinion and distract from problems at home.
This analysis leads us to a really crucial point: the test of maturity for these global poles. A moral test of power that applies just as much to the U.S. as it does to China. Starting with the U.S., it says we have to shed our imperial reflexes.
And the source delivers a truly devastating critique on this point. It highlights the sheer callousness displayed during certain trade negotiations, specifically with India. It points to a demand made by U.S. negotiators that would have required the immediate destruction of the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of Indian farmers by stripping away protective trade barriers all at once. The source labels this as nothing short of colonial arrogance.
That's a remarkable comparison. It says it's as if the British Empire changed addresses and re-emerged in Washington. And go. We need to unpack that analogy. What makes that specific demand removing subsidies for small farmers colonial in its nature?
It's colonial because it treats the long-term social stability of a partner nation as completely irrelevant compared to the immediate unilateral demand for market access. Historically, colonial powers would dismantle local, independent economic structures, like India's original textile industry or its local agriculture, to force the colony to become reliant on goods and systems from the imperial center. The U.S. demand, which would have led to the mass insolvency and displacement of hundreds of millions of subsistence farmers, threatens to recreate that exact same kind of catastrophic social upheaval, all driven by an external power's demand.
It's a profound moral myopia. It's a failure to see the other side as a society of human beings, and instead just seeing them as a market to be opened. The source even notes that Churchill, a man responsible for the Bengal famine, not exactly a paragon of colonial sensitivity, even he might have hesitated to state such destructive demands so bluntly.
And that's the point. A multipolar world requires a completely different mindset. It requires mutual accommodation, a respect for each nation's domestic priorities, and genuine dialogue. Unilateral demands that ignore the massive human cost. That's the reflex of an old empire. It's not the necessary maturity of a new partner trying to build a stable world. It destroys the very legitimacy you need before you can even start building.
So if the old system is failing and the major powers are still acting out these old, immature scripts, the challenge is building a new structure. What are the principles for a legitimate global architecture? One that's, as the source says, designed for equilibrium, not for dominance.
The sources outline 4 critical principles that would be necessary for any stable, legitimate multipolar framework, and they all represent a radical shift away from the old assumptions of American primacy. First is shared enforcement. You have to move away from the model of a single unilateral global policeman. Authority has to be distributed, it has to be backed by collective will and multiple financial contributors.
And the second.
The second is economic pluralism.
Yeah.
You have to recognize and allow for multiple divergent development paths to coexist. The Chinese state capitalist model, the European social democratic model, the Indian market model, none of them should be seen as the single correct path. And critically, this means you have to address the structural problems caused by the U.S. dollar's exorbitant privilege.
Can you clarify that for us? How exactly did the dollar's special status end up hollowing out the U.S. economy itself?
It's a fascinating and tragic feedback loop. Because the dollar was the world's main reserve currency, the U.S. could finance massive, persistent trade deficits by essentially printing the money the rest of the world needed. In the short term, this was great for American consumers. It kept the price of imported goods very low. But over decades, it made U.S. exports permanently more expensive and less competitive on the global market. This dynamic directly incentivized American companies to offshore their industrial production to cheaper countries, which led to the hollowing out of the U.S. manufacturing base. It created those massive pockets of internal economic despair we talked about earlier, the very despair that now fuels the drug crisis.
Wow, so that's a direct link. The privilege of global dominance, the dollar status, directly caused the domestic dysfunction of manufacturing job loss and despair.
It is the ultimate structural feedback loop, which leads to the third principle, civilizational neutrality. The new architecture can't be about exporting one political or religious model. It has to be a neutral platform for cooperation, not a tool for ideological conversion. And the fourth principle is equity. The new economic and trade rules have to be explicitly designed to reduce the extreme global asymmetries in wealth, debt, and poverty, rather than entrenching them for the benefit of the already established powers.
This sounds like an immense shift, moving from just reacting to crises to actually building these new systemic frameworks. It requires the world's great powers to finally recognize the real cost of just kicking the can down the road.
It demands a completely new perspective on global architecture.
Yeah.
The source suggests that a C5 dialogue, a core group of China, the U.S., India, Russia, and Japan, might be a necessary starting point, just because of their sheer economic and military weight.
But the sources are quick to add a major warning that this C5 cannot be the final frame. Why not?
Because any system that just replicates the old Security Council model, a small, exclusive club of great powers making decisions for everyone else, is already obsolete. It would just reproduce the exact same failures of legitimacy that are sinking the post-1945 order right now. Legitimacy, again, has to scale horizontally. A stable global system needs broad inclusion, not just a vertical hierarchy enforced by a few powerful countries.
It comes back to that metaphor of the plumbing. The world is a city that has just massively outgrown its original pipe system. The old pipes still carry some water, but the pressure is building up in places that were never designed to handle the 21st century volume of power and complexity.
And those pressure points are manifesting as predictable failures. The leaks are the proxy wars, the backups are the sanctions, and the catastrophic bursts are the total state collapses we see in the most fragile parts of the world. The solution isn't to keep putting more pressure on the old, rusting pipes. It's to build new, stronger, and fundamentally more inclusive infrastructure that's designed for the world as it is, not as it was. The cost of institutional delay is always paid in conflict, in lost decades, and in human lives.
So we started this deep dive with one specific dramatic action, the Trump administration against Maduro in 2026. And that single event acted like a massive lever, forcing us to pry open this whole question of the systemic collapse of the post-1945 structures. We've seen how that geopolitical failure is just inextricably linked to the domestic despair and the institution paralysis within the global enforcer itself.
We have. And we've established that the old order is collapsing, not because it suddenly failed in some moral sense, but because it structurally succeeded in creating a world, a multipolar world that's been a reality since at least 2008, that its own institutions were never designed to manage. This is a structural design problem, and it demands a proactive, equitable new architecture, one built for equilibrium and shared enforcement, moving away from that old model of unilateral dominance. And we connect all this back to the bigger picture. The central choice that's in front of all of us is whether we can build sustainable stability without first establishing fundamental legitimacy. Whether you look at the criminalized state in Venezuela, or the post-intervention chaos in Libya, or the manufacturing of despair that drives the drug crisis in America, the pattern is the same. Tactical enforcement without a plan for structural continuity and social resilience only ever leads to deeper, longer-term instability. The design of the system will always determine its durability.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you to consider, building directly on the source material we've explored today. The question is no longer whether we should intervene in morally compelling crises like Venezuela. The impulse to act against criminalized states is often powerful and it's often justified. The real structural question is whether we can intervene in a way that actually builds legitimate, sustainable governance. Or if every future intervention, in the absence of a new global design, will simply deepen the rot that's caused by the limits of power when it's exercised without accepted authority. Stability in a multipolar world is a design problem. It's a grand engineering challenge. It is not a natural state. The question is, how will you engage in designing that future, rather than just surviving the chaos?